I propose just very quickly a general question to people and ask them to perhaps make a couple of comments on that. But I guess, Helen, starting with you, look, you've had experience at state level, you've been involved in COAG meetings, you've looked at issues around federation, you've looked at issues around taxation. Why has it been so hard, from your perspective, at the national level for governments to just focus on this budget deficit problem? And from a state perspective, were there any suggestions you would have made over the last several years to try and improve that?
Well, that's a very broad question, I might say, and I appreciate being here today and doing this. In terms of why has it been so difficult, I'm a bit more of an optimistic view. And I know that there's an argument, and we've put it in here, that we need to do something. But I'm more of the optimistic side, that we actually have done things before and that reform is possible and big change is possible. And that's why I really supported what we've done at the CEDA work, because I think it actually does try to demonstrate there are realistic options. And what it does in doing that, it gives us some empirical basis under which to assess them. And where we've got reform before, and we've done it many times, is we've actually been able to put out into the public arena evidence base that says, on an empirical base, you can do these changes. What we don't have, and what is very difficult to achieve, is some level of bipartisan agreement and dialogue that we need to get to do these changes. And I mean, everyone talks about leadership and is there sufficient leadership? I think there is sufficient leadership, and we have got a process by which people want to engage, and I will refer to the recent COAG that was here, which in some ways a number of people said, well, why did we get that was a failure? I actually saw that COAG is quite successful in the sense that it got on the table for the states an income tax surcharge discussion, and it is in the communique, there will be discussion on that. I saw that as positive. You've got competition reform up. Now, why is that important for deficits? Well, that's about productivity growth in the future, and we have a process to do that. And we got activity-based funding for public hospitals agreed that it should go across Australia, which we know will lead to more efficient outcomes in public hospitals. So for me, I think there is a process to go forward. Would I say what areas that are there? I think we've identified the spending areas that you could focus on at the Commonwealth level. At the state level, we put up, I mean, it's interesting, our report shows, and it's been my experience at the state level, that the budgets are actually not in a bad state. What the issue for state governments is a revenue source that's a growth source of revenue, so that they can deal with their competing demands in terms of particularly in the health system.
Terry, you've had the experience of being both at the national and at the state level. Do you agree with Helen that there has been a degree of willingness to embrace some of these things? As an outsider, if you were to say, for example, when a Prime Minister comes along and announces the next day we're going to have a COAG meeting to talk about taxation reform and want to propose handing back some taxing powers to the states, I would have thought that not necessarily is the way to prepare the way forward. Do you have a response to that in terms then of tackling this broader question with the budget deficit?
Well, funny you should ask me that question, Stephen. I've got a strong view there. I think the Prime Minister dropped that out publicly after several months of two premiers dropping out their own version of the same thing. Secondly, what he mentioned had been in various government papers for ages. It was not fresh. A lot of work had been done on it, including at the Commonwealth level. Thirdly, the one mistake was to bifurcate schooling into government schools and Catholic and independent and say the Commonwealth will look after one bit and the states can have the other. That's very bad policy, and it also undermined the argument. But finally, if I'd been advising him, which I don't do that sort of thing anymore, I would have said, it's a great idea, why don't you raise it with the premiers over dinner at night, in the night. They're not being publicly confronted with it, and you can push them a bit on how much they'd accept. And then at the meeting, you can set up a process whereby the Commonwealth and the states and the territories could talk it through. That's how a COAG usually works. If I could make one comment on what Helen said, I agree that we've got a very successful line of reform behind us over a few decades, and a lot of that has included both expenditure reform and tax reform. I think the approach to balancing the budget in the paper is very easy to do. It's not rocket science, it's straightforward, it's sellable, and the Commission was very conscious of coming up with initiatives that were sellable when this was put together. And I also agree that it's central that we give prime importance to balancing the budget. But even though there's reform of Commonwealth taxation being pushed by various stakeholder groups, the big taxation reform that hasn't been done and the biggest challenge is at the state level. And so although David Martin won't like me saying this, I think it's time that state treasuries pulled the finger out and got into building reasonable revenue bases for the states that aren't so dependent as they are on property transactions and a narrowly based payroll tax take, as is the case at the moment. And only when the states look seriously at reform of what they do and stop crying all the time, not that David would do this because he comes from the Commonwealth, but some states do, crying all the time for ever more money from the Commonwealth, which creates pressures at the Commonwealth end that gets in the way of doing the things that they should be doing properly. It's only when the states grow up, I think, that we'll have a more mature political debate about the full range of reforms that's needed.
John, from your experience, because in a past life, of course, you were a senior economic advisor to a Prime Minister, but I just wonder, Terry's point about a number of these options, particularly around the taxation system, had been floated for some time. But if you have the situation, for example, where a couple of state premiers are used as stalking horses around something like the GST, and then it gets swept away, from your experience, how does that then translate into dealing with then the fundamental issues, as you've rightly pointed out in your commentary today, in reining in not only expenditure but also lifting the revenue sources that are necessary?
Well, I don't think we're anywhere near the end of this discussion, and I'm not at all pessimistic about it. We may well get an outcome that's a little bit better than we now expect, and one reason I say this is that Stephen's quite right that GST is taken off the table. Personally, I think that's a good thing, and the reasons the government took it off the table I think are compelling. That is, by the time you've compensated the people who are going to lose out, you don't have much left over to do anything with. But it was the case a year ago, and I remember Laura Tingle writing this in the Fin, pointing this out, and it was true that suddenly you had both the government and the opposition talking about similar tax enhancements, capital gains, negative gearing, and super, the very ones that we're talking about. Now, Stephen's quite right that that discussion has since become quite muted, but it's actually there. There's no ideological kind of reason to expect that dispute to persist, I think. And that's why I think sooner or later the outcome of this protracted fiscal debate is going to end up somewhere along the lines that we've proposed in the CEDA report.
Fab, of course, as a ratings agency, you look at a number of different issues, and clearly any government's ability to maintain the highest possible ratings is beneficial. But if we look at our report and you look at it from the expenditure side and the propositions that have been included in for cutting expenditure, how significant will they be in terms of the business community's response and recognition that that will play a very important part still in not only balancing the budget but stimulating the economy as well?
Yes, well, thanks, Stephen. I think one of the things that I think is very interesting at the moment is that for a long time both sides of politics have been committed to balancing the budget in terms of the rhetoric that you hear, but increasingly what we're having is a longer lag time between those statements and reality in terms of what's playing out. And I think that that's pretty important in the case of Australia for a couple of reasons. I think the credibility around that is amplified because of Australia's very weak external position and the reliance on offshore investors. So notwithstanding the fact that our overall debt relative to a lot of countries is fairly low, our external position is weak, and Australia is a lot more vulnerable to external investors changing their sentiment. So I think the credibility piece is really, really important. It's also something that we look at quite closely, I guess, in terms of how we assign our ratings, and we do have a forward-looking view in terms of our ratings and take into account, expectations around government looking to restore budget balance and surpluses. And, I think it is worth looking at, say, the Western Australian government where that lack of political will was actually one of the factors that we cited when we downgraded Western Australia from AAA to AA. I also think from a personal perspective, having spent a long time working for a rating agency, I'm not a big fan of targeting ratings as the key objective in any measure. I think that the rating outcome should be just that, an output and an outcome from actually undertaking the right policies, and that sometimes the right policies may in fact be ones that actually lead to the rating being lowered in certain circumstances. I think going back to the comments I made before around the reliance on offshore wholesale markets, unfortunately, in my personal view, I think that Australia is a little bit more reliant on the AAA rating because of that than would be ideal.
Thank you. Look, the opportunity is available, of course, for people now to ask some questions. Don't be shy. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We have microphones that will be roving around, and if you could just indicate who you are, the organisation that you represent. Thank you.
Yeah, Tony Greco, Institute of Public Accountants. I agree with the CEDA position in that the deficits are too big to ignore. I think it was Barnaby Joyce has been told not to bring it to everyone's attention, but he used to basically say we're adding $1 billion to the credit card on a monthly basis. So I agree with CEDA's position. It is something we're putting on to the future generations. But my comment was in relation to some of your options. I've just had a quick read of the paper, and a lot of them are in relation to concessions and moving some of those, reducing the cost to revenue on a lot of those concessions. But you're basically saying that we need to fix the budget before we look at tax reform. So isn't it also productivity an issue here? And we've got to move away from a 1950s model where we tax incomes, and that's where the GST was part of the mix, but not... I mean, GST on its own was never going to be the solution. It was never going to be the silver bullet. It's more about a package of measures to improve productivity, and one way is to move away from taxes or essentially taxes that tax growth incomes. So moving away from those sort of taxes would increase the pie, and by increasing the pie, I think we're all better off. So it's a long-term solution. But by just looking at some of the concessions, I think there's going to be negative impacts. I think your comment was there wouldn't be an impact on the marketplace by doing some of these things, and I'm not sure. I think you've mentioned that we are in a weak position, especially when you mention from an international perspective, we're very reliant on overseas capital coming to Australia, and the company tax rate is not very competitive, and also our AAA rating. So more holistically, isn't it better to do the big things now, even though we are in a perilous situation, than delay the inevitable?
I can start that off. So I think if you look at this report, and CEDA's doing other work which I think fits more into that long-term structural reform bucket. And I think if you look at this report, what it's really saying is we've got an issue and we need to actually resolve that fairly quickly to take away the noise so we can actually focus on those longer-term issues. My view is that a lot of the things that need to happen are going to actually take time, and there's a lot of work that's going to need to go into those reforms, both to build consensus with the electorate, but also to actually, make the changes that we need to go forward. The reforms that are in here, or the options, were really things that you could do relatively quickly. They weren't to say that those other things aren't things we need to do in the longer term as well. But
in launching this report in Canberra, Paul McClintock, the CEDA National Chair, was asked a question about the relationship between balancing the budget and tax reform, and he said, and I agree with this statement of his, that once you've locked away the measures that will deliver you a balanced budget in 2018-19, and this is something that could theoretically be done in the forthcoming budget, once you've done that, you can then go immediately to the debate about tax reform. And I agree with Fab's comment that tax reform debate hasn't been properly had because the community hasn't been presented with the trade-offs that are possible. My other point would be that when you look at the big national tax reforms in times past, there's usually been a heavy reliance on trading tax expenditures and concessions on the one hand, eliminating them or modifying them, for significant changes in the tax rate, whether it's the corporate tax rate or the marginal tax rates that we all pay for personal income tax. And that is presumably at the heart of what the Commonwealth Government would want to do. But my rather cheeky point, and David Martin hasn't attacked me yet, I'm sure he will, about what the states do, is that the states are the great unreformed world of investment negative taxes, like the way payroll tax is levied only on big employers and then at a high rate, which discourages them employing staff, and on property transactions, which is not only a problem for would-be householders, but it's also a problem for corporates that want to trade out of one piece of property into another. And so I think that the community and business is allowing the states to get off the hook too easily if they don't start saying, well, you've avoided any serious attempt at reforming your tax base for a long time, apart from giving more of it away in various concessions that have been made. You've got to be part of this discussion as well.
I think just one of the other things that came through in the report, which we haven't discussed today, which I think is very important, is that there's also a link in terms of actually bringing and restoring the budget to surplus now, and the size of the problem down the track. And we're facing headwinds in terms of ageing population and climate change and other things that are putting downward pressure on revenues. Our terms of trade have reduced. This is something that's going to come back even if we fix it now, and if we don't restore it and don't actually deal with it now, the problem's even bigger down the road and all the more difficult to resolve. It's actually interesting because when I was preparing for this, I went digging around in our S&P research, and we in our 2013 global ageing analysis, we actually ran scenarios, which I wish I'd shared with Nathan and found it beforehand. He might have found it useful, but looking from in 10-year increments out to 2050, the old age dependency ratio expected to nearly double from 20 to 39%. Total age-related spending up from 11.4% in 2010 to over 18% in 2050. With a no policy change scenario, the AAA rating based on holding things steady at 2010 would be triple B by 2050, and AA would be falling by 2030. If we manage to balance the budget in 2016, the AAA under holding those scenarios steady would still be AAA in 2030. You'd still have a problem later on down the track, but at least you delayed it. And if we actually had no additional age-related spending, the AAA would be maintained out to 2050. So I think that actually supports a lot of the things that we're saying, that it's both a spending and an expenditure issue. It's just a matter of timing and when you actually bring those in, but it's going to be a contribution of both.
I was just actually going to make that point, not in as well as you did, obviously, but the point is that there is immediacy to deal with the problem, because if you don't, the numbers just get worse, and that makes the problem more difficult. And also, as you know, it's better to have identified that problem and deal with it directly if you try and deal, and this is what the experience that I've had in putting policy changes with a mix of things, it is much more difficult to actually manage those, but also to do with which what Terry's been talking about, get the community understanding what the trade-offs are. That's why we singularly are focusing on this issue, and because of the immediacy and the need to do it as quickly as possible, because if you don't, this gets out of hand very quickly. On the second issue, I can't not let Terry get away with just saying that at the state government. There has been, it's governments plural. There has been quite a bit of reform at the state level on taxation. And I mean, the GST, when it was put in fact, and I have to say the Victorian government led the way, removed a number of very poor taxes, which were impediments to what we would say is economic activity. That was done then. It was quite a significant change that was done in a trade-off for a GST, and frankly for New South Wales and Victoria, who ended up having those monies put through the Commonwealth Grants Commission and therefore didn't get their per capita share back. That was really quite tough for them and has been over the longer term. I think you're right, though, in the more important point that if you're going to talk about tax reform, you do need to talk about it at the Commonwealth and state level, and particularly at the state level where we know the pressures I've already pointed out about health, but it's also population growth and how are we going to pay for that and go forward. And particularly in New South Wales and Victoria, where that's really hitting the large cities, they do need a very strong revenue base, and the state bases are much more narrowly based. So there is, some opportunity. I look at the ACT government. I think the things they've done on stamp duty, that trade-off for land tax, it's a long change, it's 2 decades, it's a big reform, another big reform that's been done. Yes, people are saying now, we're getting worried about it, but it is inexorable. They will do that change, and I think that shows you, and I'm sure state treasuries are looking at that, how they can do these sorts of reforms.
Thank you. While people are thinking of another question, and I have one down there in a moment, John, the issue for us, of course, as part of this exercise was to look at both the revenue and the expenditure side. The response from Treasurer Morrison was clearly not supportive of the concept of increasing taxation revenue or the revenue side based on any measure of taxation change, but clearly, again, emphasising the expenditure side of the problem. From your perspective as a leading member of this commission, how do we get that dialogue to recognise that expenditure and revenue go hand in glove?
Yeah, well, thanks, Stephen. Well, I think, I think the Commission really agrees with the Treasurer. That is that, and we explicitly say in the short term, we have a revenue issue, and in the longer term, we recognise we've got a spending issue. That is, as the Treasury's intergenerational report shows, if we do get to a balanced budget, say 2021, 21, 22, if we do get to a balanced budget, and at that point tax is 23.9% of GDP, we'll soon go back into deficit. And the reason we'll soon go back into deficit is that spending under current policy will continue to increase faster than nominal GDP. And so even if we get our revenue up to the point where the major political parties have agreed it should be, we'll then run right back into deficit unless we can control spending. So in the longer term, we do have a spending problem. The Treasurer is quite right in that respect, and we, for example, indicate in our report that we'll need to look at things like raising the pension age to 70 and the parallel access to super age. Those kind of changes make a huge difference. But if we don't do something, then by 2054, 55, say, even if the economy continues to travel extraordinarily well, we'll still have a deficit of 6% of GDP, of which 2/3 will be public debt interest. It's not a pleasant prospect at all. But I would say, so we agree with the Treasurer on that. We also agree with, but I rather think the Treasurer agrees with us on revenue, because this is exactly what the Treasurer's forward estimates display. They display the deficit being narrowed over a somewhat longer time frame than we think is desirable, but also by revenue. But in his case, by bracket creep rather than by, as we suggest, by removing some of the concessionality that we currently offer, so that you'll then be in a position to remove bracket creep.
Thank you. My name's Paul Abbey from PwC. I just wanted to return to the topic of state tax reform, which Terry Moran raised and Helen Silver commented on. And the ACT government is a good example, because the advantage of the ACT government is when they institute good policy, like the reform to stamp duty, they'll be returned to government. When they introduce bad policy, like a light rail, which no one will travel on, they'll still be returned to government. And that sets out the challenge for other state governments, which is that if they adopt tax reform policy in regard to payroll tax or in regard to stamp duty, they're putting themselves at political risk. And so doesn't that then mean that the actor who's not subject to political risk in regard to those issues, which is the Commonwealth, is the one who should be the leader in regard to state tax reform and should lead each one of the states through that reform and be able to give them the compensating revenue outcomes that changing their systems will need them to have, but also be able to give them the political coverage?
Do you want me to? Thank you for that very interesting question, and you're right about the ACT on the switch away from stamp duty to, in effect, a land tax or a property tax. And it's got a long phase-in period, I think, so that's taken away
20 years.
20 years, Helen says, takes away a lot of the immediate anxieties that many people would face. I've argued publicly that the states more generally should do exactly the same thing, but hypothecate the revenues to transport investments in the cities in which the revenues are raised. So all of Melbourne would have a fund set up into which all the property or land tax was paid, Bendigo likewise, and then you could have a proper citywide approach to planning how infrastructure will be improved. With payroll tax, it was originally set up by the Commonwealth with the states as a growth tax. The states then immediately narrowed down the base amazingly and put up the rate for those who did have to pay it. And the easiest change there is to reverse that trend and go back to nearly all employers paying a small amount, instead of a very small number of employers paying a very large amount, those employers who happen to be the people best able to create more jobs in our society. Having said all that, the Commonwealth could only usefully contribute to what the states have got to do if, in balancing out Commonwealth tax reforms with state tax reforms, you're able to demonstrate to households that a variety of different sorts of households are no worse off than they were previously. Unless you could do that, I think what the Prime Minister is now doing, or says he's going to do, which is putting pressure by denying money on the states and territories to think about their revenue bases, is probably sensible policy.
Your comment about hypothecation is right in that with the fire service levy in Victoria and the essential services levy in Western Australia, the other solution to introducing a change to stamp duty for a broader based land tax is stealth.
So, just taking up from, and I think it's a really good question, I think that to say that states can't do the reforms is actually, I think, unfair. I mean, I think it is difficult to do reform, and I understand the ACT government issue, although they have got independence in their parliament that can cause them issues. So to say that you can do reform irrespective, I don't think is actually the case in their government. I know they feel that pain. I think it does come back to just basically the state government, like all these areas, it's difficult to do good reform, but if you identify clearly what the problem is, you do good empirical analysis, you seek to get some transparency and community support, and as much as possible bipartisan support, and obviously that is good, but it is difficult, but you get stronger. The stronger you've got community support for the change, the more likely you tap into bipartisan support, and you have a very clear implementation plan. Now, an implementation plan, maybe you need to hypothecate. The only reason that you'd be wanting to be careful about that is hypothecation can also cause its own problems and in constraining how you've got to, you're never sure where the problems, 10 years, 15 years down the track are. And so that is one way you can do it. There is other ways that you can do it, and I was involved with a very large reform in the early 2000s, which was a major change in concessions. And were a number of people who had very significant concessions like TAC concessions. There was a lot of shouting about it, but a basic reform package then gave different concessions and was explained to the community. I think, there's ways to do these things, and that's why I'm an optimist. I do believe you can do the reform. It takes time, and I think states can do it. The Commonwealth engagement at the state level on this, I do think they have a role to encourage particularly productivity enhancing change. And so in that capacity, being part of a bigger, broader tax reform debate is important.
Just a personal observation and a more general observation in addition to Helen's comments. One of my personal observations is that potentially too, in terms of building that community consensus, possibly a little bit more work around the sequencing of things. And I think we saw that very much in terms of the 2015 budget, that some of the things that weren't dealt with there weren't dealt with because they were in the tax white paper, but they, I think a lot of the backlash really reflected that they were hitting further down the income spectrum and welfare spectrum than some of the things further up. And I think, when you're trying to actually build consensus for large changes that potentially will impact people, it's that fairness test comes back, and it's good to get the sequencing right.
Could I just make one very... In my observation of the past several decades, it's really only master politicians at the top end of any government that can carry off successful tax reform. The challenge, therefore, for the federal government at the moment is one of how great is their technical capability as politicians to do something serious on the tax reform front when the time looks appropriate. Now is not the time. But in the meantime, I agree with CEDA's proposition that we should balance the budget while we wait for the right time for tax reform to come along. And at that point, having balanced the budget, or shown how it will be balanced, we've got a cleaner basis for a debate than we would have at the moment.
Let me sort of step out of being involved in the preparation of this and put to the panel that CEDA had done some work 2 years ago on a federation for the 21st century. We had done so because an incoming government had said two significant issues that needed to be dealt with was, one, the federation and assigning appropriate responsibilities in the modern era between the various levels of government, and secondly, there was to be a taxation white paper process. And we had argued at the time that the two could run in parallel, but at some stage they would have to come together. What we have seen is that the Federation white paper process has just disappeared in smoke. There was never a green paper. There were a number of discussion papers that emerged. There was no green paper, and there certainly hasn't been a white paper around the nature of federation. What we have seen in terms of the taxation white paper process, again, is some discussion papers, but then the whole concept of emerging of a green paper and then a subsequent white paper emerging has disappeared, and so many things have also subsequently disappeared in public discussion. So from CEDA's perspective, where we've been advocating and certainly putting these issues out on the table for discussion, I'm interested to get the panel's collective view as to, do you genuinely believe, as we've advocated in this report, that if the government, whoever that might be, accepts what we've suggested and gets our budget back into balance and then potentially into surplus, that there would be a genuine effort then to take on these significant reforms around federation and taxation, which clearly will underpin the economic growth of Australia? Does the panel have a view on that?
Well, I think Terry said it very well, that the deficit is an impediment to moving on to these other issues, which we all recognise are, we've got a lot of room for improvement, a lot of room for gains in these other issues. But there's something troubling about the idea, for example, that we would do all the vast work necessary, say, to produce a revenue-neutral tax reform package one day, and then, having enacted it, find the next day we still had a deficit of $37 billion. That's really what we're talking about. Let's get that out of the way first. It's easier to do, and maybe it demonstrates, if we can do it, it demonstrates to us that we're still capable of making these kind of changes.
Fab?
Yeah, well, I don't. This is a personal comment, since I'm not. I don't have the insights that all of my other panel members would have on this. But we do have an interesting sort of dynamic in terms of the political process, and I just I think I've heard it mentioned several times. Really in the last decade, just the impact of the 24-hour news cycle and what that's doing in terms of the quality of the discourse, which I think is challenging. It would be. I think often adversity is unfortunately the mother of invention, and I think that one of our other great dilemmas at the moment is that we have come through almost a quarter century of uninterrupted economic growth, and we're somewhat fat, complacent, and I think possibly a little bit lazy at dealing with some of these issues. The trouble is we don't actually need to imagine or make up what the future looks like if we don't start to deal with these issues sooner rather than later. We have some fantastic examples worldwide now that are much further along the process in terms of ageing and having significant sovereign debt issues, and that's certainly not a proposition that I think that many of us aspire to in terms of the Australia we live in. So,
I think most of the public contributions by various groups in our society to the tax debate have been driven by self-interest. I'm not thinking of what CEDA has done here. I'm thinking of, some of my best friends are involved with the BCA, for example, but I think the BCA's contributions over the last year have been overwhelmingly look after us and the rest of you can bugger off, if I can put it in those terms. So there's a hole left for determined politicians who want to pursue tax reform. And the truth is that we've had treasurers over a significant period that have done that. Keating did it, Costello did it, and Wayne Swan did it. People have lost sight of the fact that in a succession of budgets, Swan found means of making significant savings and adjustments to the benefit in the taxation system. So it's what we need as a nation is a placid, clear line ahead for a government, having been elected or re-elected. States that don't want to turn tax reform into an argument for just more money for them rather than them facing up to their own tax reform initiatives. And also a bit more flexibility and commitment to microeconomic reform in some of the really big expenditure areas. There's a long way further to go on the health system, particularly government's contribution to the private health sector. It's the area where the costs are out of control, not the public sector. And there are major microeconomic reform contributions that could be made in education, not just schools, but vet and universities as well. And those reforms could take out some of the pressures on expenditures and wind back some of the, as Joe Hockey used to describe it, the age of entitlement concerns that some people think are out there in the community. But all of this needs the X factor of masterful and creative political leadership.
I agree with what's just been said before, and I do absolutely agree with the point about the need for political leadership and how you do that. And it's an easy thing to say, but is a technical competency about how do you explain these things that is required, and that's not saying we don't currently have it, but that's what is a platform to go forward. I do think, and I don't think you can resile away from the fact of what John said, there is an ethical issue here. This is an intergenerational transfer, unless you deal with this question, and there is a degree of lack of recognition or exposure of that, and I like the CEDA report for trying to draw that out. It's an important issue that you can't, in fact, should you be able to impose that on the future, particularly in the context, as we know, there are increasing demands coming from population and the health sector. I absolutely agree with Terry. There is real opportunities to work on the expenditure side in different ways to do those reforms. And another area I would put on the table is the recent work that the Grattan Institute has done on infrastructure, which they've said the big issue here is not whether we have enough money on infrastructure. I think we do have enough money going into infrastructure. It's the where it's going and the lack of transparency. And that if you do have projects that have a BCR that is positive in the right direction, yes, we should fund it. The problem has been that a hell of a lot has been funded over a number of years that does not have that. So that's in itself a saving if you're not requiring to pour an additional extra amount into infrastructure simply because we haven't got that transparency.
Could I add a remarks? About 3 or 4 weeks ago, the Prime Minister gave an important speech in Sydney on the issue of infrastructure. And what he said was that he thought the Commonwealth should change its approach to funding infrastructure from transactions based in budget expenditures to investments by the Commonwealth in particular large projects around the country, with those investments being handled on the Commonwealth's balance sheet. In other words, if they buy an asset being part of a major metro system or part of a road, and there's some income associated with that purchase, that would enable the Commonwealth to borrow money to make that investment without any increase in net debt. Now, we'll see how that works out in the budget context, but it's possible that the Commonwealth might lead the way in into a fresh approach beyond what we've been doing with public-private partnerships in Australia on how to do the big infrastructure projects. And if that's the case, that will help accommodate some of the rapid growth in population we've been receiving and do it without putting further pressure on the traditional budget equation.
And I think some of those same principles apply to social infrastructure and delivery of social services. It's not just the expenditure piece, it's also innovation and improvements in social services delivery by working on data and rigorous evidence-based outcomes focus rather than a focus on activities and inputs, which I think a number of governments are focusing in on at the moment. So,
thanks, Fab. John, did you want final? No, you're comfortable and relaxed? Good. Look, that unfortunately has brought us to the end of today's discussion. I hope, as I said in my introductory remarks, that people do take an opportunity to read our report. I know I say about every one of the reports that we put out that it's a page turner and won't put you to sleep, but this one certainly won't. There's been a lot of careful thought gone into it, and as I think our panellists have indicated, the contribution that each of them have made and others as part of our commission were thoughtful, were pragmatic, but all had the one goal in mind, and that is to try and convince government that there was a a reasonably easy way to get to a balanced budget and to turn that into surplus, and that it was critical that that be done so because the major reforms that are still necessary for Australia as our economy adjusts will be dependent upon the ability of government to meet its bills. And I'd like you, therefore, on that note, to join me in thanking our 4 panellists for a terrific contribution.